You are listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com. Welcome back, everyone. I'm Chris, and for the purposes of this episode, let's just say I have only one thumb and it can do one of two things: point upwards or downwards. There are simply no other options. The quality of films assessed the exact same way that Joaquin Phoenix decides whether a gladiator gets to live or die. I have to warn our listeners here, if there's anyone in our audiences that already have their spreadsheets out with a clear outline of what the perfect rating scale is, this episode is about far more than numbers, stars, thumbs, percentages, die, or even tomatoes. It's about communication. It's about the purpose of the ratings themselves. Are we communicating something to the people who see our ratings, or is it simply for ourselves? And if the former, if the rating truly is about communication, which is clearly the case for critics, but also for many of us, is it valuable communication? Are you actually providing some kind of information another human being can see and use? With us today to walk down this question of essentially existential dread for many of us are three absolutely wonderful co-hosts, Adam, Tom, and Saul. Introduce yourselves, guys, and let's kick this off.
Hi, I'm Adam. I'm not going to be able to match Chris's incredible levels of enthusiasm since I woke up 10 minutes ago, but I'm very happy to join today.
Hi, this is Tom from England. Excited to be here and discuss the rating scale with everyone today.
Hi, it's Saul from Australia, and I'm also very curious about talking about this topic, especially because my stance on ratings has changed so much.
Now that sounds exciting, and same for me actually. So let's just jump right into it. And I think we already have our answer more or less, but do you rate films? And if so, how long have you been doing it? And do you actually take ratings seriously?
Okay, so I've been rating films for as long as I've been a member of IMDb, which is September 2001. So initially when I was rating films, I did take the ratings very seriously because I was only a teenager when I joined, and I thought, this needs to be something that reflects really well what I thought about a film, what its quality was. As it's evolved over the years, ratings have become a lot more meaningless to me, and it now comes to the stage where I don't really think too much about my ratings at all. I don't really care about them. I don't think they reflect that much. I still use them because the websites that I'm registered at require you to rate films in order to see them. Like at iCheck Movies, you can just tick a box and it's checked. But if I'm logging something on IMDb, I need to actually rate it, so I still need to have a rating. And with Letterboxd, you do have the option, but it's much easier to sort through what you've seen if you've given it a rating.
Like Saul, I started rating films when I joined IMDb. I think it was a little later on at the start of university. So that would have been around 2005. And like so many of these episodes have mentioned, it was the IMDb Top 250 that started my passion for films. And that influenced my rating scale to some degree. Now, a film needed at least an 8 to feature in the IMDb Top 250. So when I started rating films, I'd only give it 8 or above to any films that I deemed worthy of inclusion in the top 250 from my perspective. And that's something that has stuck with me throughout. So I do take my rating seriously. I rate on 4 separate websites after watching a film, so I keep track of everything. But I love just using ratings to help me pick out films to watch and guide my viewing habits, although I agree with Sol that they do become less meaningful as you go on and watch so many films.
All right, now I think we actually have a proper debate going, because I think your view of the ratings are a bit controversial. Let's just jump to Adam first and continue.
Yes, similar to Tom and Sol, I started rating films when I joined IMDb and when I was watching the top 250. So I think in around 2008 or 2009, when I was at university. I don't think I take the ratings that I give, that seriously, but I do take the rating on IMDb seriously, or Rotten Tomatoes, or any website like that. Although my opinion on IMDb ratings has probably changed. I probably value IMDb ratings less than I did when I first started using the site.
I have a bit of a question for Tom before we move on. You said that you rate films or mark them as seen on 4 websites. So obviously we've got IMDb, iCheck Movies, and Letterboxd. What's the 4th one that you use?
The 4th one is Flickchart, which basically ranks all of your films in order of preference. And each time you watch a film, the website matches it up with one of the other films you've seen, and you say which film you prefer. And it does that about 10 times for a new film, and then positions it accordingly in the grand list of films. So every time you watch a new film, it kind of puts it up and works out where it should be in your preference. It's quite fun.
I remember this website. I thought it was dead. I used to use it like over a decade ago.
I love it, but I mean, it's one of those that if you've not used it for some time, there's no way you're going to go back and put every single film that you've ever seen in there because of the amount of time that would now take you.
Yeah, I think that website was recommended to me back in the IMDb days. Somebody was using it, and I do see it pop every so often on Letterboxd. The whole comment will be like where it entered on their flick chart and all the things that it showed them. But I think the thing which got me about that one is that you rate it after you've seen it. But a lot of films, for me, when I have a few days to think it over, my preference about it changes. So I don't think I'd ever want anything as static as that, but I understand the appeal of it.
I was actually surprised no one mentioned Criticker. I'm not on it anymore either, but that was also one of the ones that were really big for a while. I started thinking about Criticker when Tom was speaking, because that also had this view of ratings that they were proportional to what we had seen rather than based on some kind of firmer criteria. Like I remember importing all my ratings and like my 8s becoming 71, for instance, or my 9s arbitrarily becoming 82s or 85s, just based on how many 9s and how many 10s and how many 8s and 7s I had, because it had this idea of how many films would be in each tier. And that seems pretty much the way Tom is thinking, though perhaps only with the top tier. Is that right, Tom?
That's right, and it's really strange because naturally I'm geared towards rating films 5 or above because I enjoy films, so I get a lot out of them. But Flickchart thinks that any film in the second half of all of the films I've watched would get a score of like 50 or below, and it doesn't really correlate well with what I've seen.
Yeah, because the problem with like things like Flickchart is they want to do a bell curve. For my viewing habits, a bell curve doesn't make sense because I know I'm a bit challenge obsessed, but I generally watch films that I want to see and that I expect to like. So I get very few films that I rate less than a 4 out of 10, just because if I don't think I like it, I'm not going to watch it. Unless I'm watching all sorts of films and not being discriminate about it at all, it makes no sense to actually have a bell curve.
Yeah, exactly. I think the only way we would even get anything close to a bell curve is if you're a professional critic and have to review absolutely everything. Like being stuck to watch every single iteration of, say, a date movie.
That sounds awful. Who would be a critic?
Sympathy for all of the critics out there. And then has to put a rating on it and write 500 to 1,000 words, depending on where they work. Though I guess there's a bit of a pleasure in writing skating reviews as well. I think we can get into just how we think about our ratings a little bit later. I have that kind of spreadsheet discussion I mentioned in the intro, stuffed away at the far end so we get our listeners a bit hyped up first. But I will definitely challenge you, Tom, on your only 250 exclusionary 8+ ratings.
It doesn't actually work that way. I don't exclude it to only 250. It now goes, I think I've probably got about 500 odd films that are 8 or above. But it was just from a perspective whether I thought the film would fit comfortably in the IMDb top 250 was part of my perspective, I suppose.
Did your opinion of the IMDb top 250 change over that time, and did that have anything to do with the change in how you were ranking and rating?
Yes, my opinion of the top 250 has changed over time as I completed it and realised that was only the tip of the iceberg, and there's so many more masterpieces that aren't even mentioned on the list. But because my way of rating films had kind of been set in stone and you become attached to it and you don't want to go back and change all your ratings, that's just kind of become fixed. So an 8 out of 10 or above is a favourite for me, and is one that I would view as sitting comfortably in the IMDb top 250, even though I don't really appreciate that list anymore.
Oh, that could lead to all kinds of weird results in that case. This one would be very pleasing to people who vote on IMDb top 250. Here's an 8. Here's 9. The most recent crowd pleaser. But I think we all talked about just how seriously we seem to take ratings now. So that was my next question. Like, what do we even mean when we say taking ratings seriously? And I suppose, while I was originally going to say no or give a more moderate response, I have actually done what you didn't do, Tom. I have gone through my ratings and changed essentially all of them at least twice in my life. On IMDb, just ranking them up from 10 to 1, and then just going through, is this actually a 10? Okay, no, 9, no 8, no 7, and you go doing that manually at least twice.
Wow, that is a lot of work.
It was, yeah, but I think as I've grown older, I've just become stricter and stricter, and a lot of things just didn't. It felt really odd to have that many tenses, especially when I didn't feel as strongly about them. So I think, like when I first started rating on IMDb, within a year or two, maybe I had seen 2,000 plus films, maybe 3,000. I had at least 100 tens, I think, and by the time I had seen 5,000 films, I had 300 or 250 tens. So I just scaled that down to probably 150, and then last time I scaled it down to well under 100. So it's just this kind of consistent trend towards becoming old and hateful and not liking films that much anymore.
That's really odd. I think I've actually got more tens generally these days than I did when I first started watching. When I first started watching and rating them on IMDb, I was really strict. Unless I thought it was a perfect film, there was nothing that I'd change about it. I wouldn't give it a 10. But these days, I'm rewatching a lot of stuff which might have given an 8 or a 9 to back in the day. And a lot of it is just rounding up to a 10 because it's in my top 200 or 300 films. And it's like, well, it might as well be a 10.
And that's actually kind of happening to me too with rewatches. There are some more films, not as many as yours, but there are some of my 9s, 9.5s that managed to creep up to the 10. But no, I think in general, I've just been stricter and stricter. Like, I usually don't see a single 10 out of 10 as the first time viewing a year anymore. And then that's with, quite a few hundred films seen. So it's getting more sad, more depressing. But I think also my ratings mean a little bit more. So it's a give and take, I guess.
I'm with you on that. I rarely see 10 these days. I think my last one was Blade Runner 2049 that really chimed with me. That was a transcendental experience that I just loved.
Ooh, interesting choice.
Yeah, it just worked for me. It was a magical experience. That I loved it. And I wanted to go back to the rating scale and about how you changed your ratings, Chris. I've got this strange arbitrary ruling in place where I will only change a rating of a film if I watch it again.
Okay, yeah.
So I've got some films that I watched when I was young and I absolutely loved and I've given a 10. And I know now that they're not a 10, but that rating is not going to change unless I go back and watch it. And at that point, I'll then be able to reassign a rating to the film.
Oh, interesting. For me, I had rated films so carefully. So at that point, I wasn't even using the 10 out of 10 scale. I was using essentially a 100-point scale. So I had everything tiered up. And I could quite easily just push like all 8s down to 7 or 7.5 and all 8.5s down to 8, for instance. So it was a bit easier for me, I guess. At one point, I even had a 200-point scale, which is ridiculous. Because I was so focused on managing to distinguish my favorite films, and I didn't have Flickchart at this point in time. First, I guess I had my ratings as 10 and 9, and then 10, 9.5, and then 9.8, 9.7, 9.6. And at one point, I think I was doing like 98.5%. Try to distinguish the tiers in my top 100. It's pointless though, utterly pointless, but for some reason I thought that was necessary and helpful.
I'm always impressed when people assign numbers to the films in that way, you know, give 97 or 96. Like, how can you differentiate between the two films that closely? And it always impresses me. I can't work out how I'd manage that kind of system.
I think it's just about emotional response and trying to quantify it, which I actually got really good at. Like, I managed to get like a pretty good sense of where it would be. I mean, it's all fairly arbitrary. There's not a big difference between 6, like 9.6, 9.7. But you know, it's all about just the exact feeling of everything from the quality to the intensity to the visuals to the acting performances. All of that kind of just blended together in my mind because I got so used to it and I could immediately give an approximate rating. And then those could change. Obviously, with the rewatch, they could change drastically, but it felt very natural to me.
Something which I might just mention if we jump back a few topics. When I re-rate a film and give it a different rating, I actually don't always change it on IMDb. I've got my own Word document, so I might change it in there, but a lot of the time it's just like, the IMDb ratings are pretty much meaningless to me. I've got one friend who like F5s and refreshes my page every single day, but most people don't look at my ratings at all, so I usually actually don't change it.
That's not even a friend, that's a fan.
He's probably going to listen to this podcast because he does know how to do podcasting, but you know, he's obsessed with my ratings and whatever. But look, most people don't care or whatever, so I've been changing my Word documents. I haven't changed it on IMDb. IMDb, I've got it as marked as seen, so that way when I do a power search, it can come up in a power search, so I've seen it. But I don't really care that much what I've rated on IMDb, but it's probably just me.
So, why are you using a Word document instead of a spreadsheet?
I am as well.
I think we've had this discussion before, but my mind is blown.
I grew up using Word documents. I've been doing this since I was 13 or 14 years old, so the first thing that you learn is Word. You get very used to and comfortable doing a Word, and I've really had no reason to migrate over. Everything's been in a Word document since 2001. Might as well stay that way.
But the best part of film watching is a spreadsheet, so come on. We need Lauren on this podcast to back me up.
I've never used spreadsheets, but I do use Word documents. Less and less, but I have this one Word document I've had since 2005, 2006, and just kept transferring between computers.
I think we need a spreadsheet episode.
I did try putting the data into a spreadsheet at one point, but there was just so much to enter that I just gave up on it. So
You can export it from IMDb, all of the information, so...
Yeah, exactly.
I guess that makes sense. But when I was doing it at the time, I was trying to copy it from Word to Excel, which was just ridiculous. So I think I gave up on it.
Oh, and just to be clear, I don't actually rate everything in spreadsheets. What I do is that I have my top list from every single year with their ratings. So everything from 8 and up, essentially. So I can always go in there for any kind of poll or vote on a forum, etc. And just my personal use to see what's my top 10 or even top 20, 30 of any given year. And I can just immediately see it and I have them tiered, you know, essentially I have 8, 8.5, 9, 9.5, and 10. That's it.
See, if you used Flickchart, you wouldn't need all those spreadsheets because that does the same thing.
I would. I'm sorry, Tom. But like Flickchart, does Flickchart break down into years?
Those years, genres, directors, everything you'd want.
Yeah. Like I think so. I used to do this before I found ICM too. I used to have every single top list I was interested in a Word document as well, just with big titles and then just the full list in text. And I would mark the films I had seen in red, and the others should be in black. Sometimes I would remove the ones I had seen, and then I would, store it. And when I found I check movies, I was like, oh, great! I don't need to do this anymore because all the lists are right there. So if someone listening would finally create a website where I could both rate and rank films and rank them in yearly lists, and I could just drop my Word document, but that doesn't exist yet. Oh well. So while we are crying about the limitations of technology in 2021, Let's get on to my next question, which I think all of us have already answered because we've only talked about the 10 out of 10 scale, which I guess means we all grew up on IMDb. But what is your rating scale of choice? Like, do you use thumbs, stars, die, 10 out of 10, percentages, 1 to 100? What is the rating scale you prefer to use?
My rating scale of choice is actually no rating scale at all. I know that sounds controversial, but when I first started posting movie reviews on the weekly threads on the I Check Movies forum, I would just post my review and I wouldn't put any ratings next to it. And I don't know, I think a few months went by, some people just said, I really just like to see a rating in there because I want to be able to see at a glance whether you like the film or not without being able to read your whole paragraph. I'm sort of like, well, that goes against the whole point. I want you reading what I've written rather than just looking at the rating. But anyway, I ended up going for a very simple system, which makes sense to me. So it's a 4-star system. And basically the 4 stars is anything which is 8 and above, so a favourite for me. 7 out of 10 is a 3 stars, 6 out of 10 above average is 2 stars. Anything which is average or below gets 1 star because it's sort of like if it's average or worse, do I really need to explain or signify just how bad it is? The fact that I've given it 1 star just shows that it's either not interesting or worse than that. So that's my preferred system, just something where I can say that I either really liked it a lot, I liked it, it was okay, or if it was average or worse. That's my preferred system. But I do use the out of 10 system because IMDb requires it. I use the 5-star system because it's the best way to reflect on Letterboxd what my position was on a film. It's not something which I think is actually necessarily something that I need. It's good to sort out things personally, but it's not something which I think I need to communicate with the world.
All right, yeah, that's actually a pretty good one. And ironically, Tom and I have both signed up to be programmers for ICMFFF, the 5th one for 2021, which is the ICM Forum Film Festival. And we pretty much use your system there, only from 0 to 3, which is essentially exactly the same format. So well done, Saul.
That's right, and I kind of struggle with systems that aren't the 1 to 10 that I've grown up with because it takes some thinking to kind of gauge exactly where films should be if the scale isn't similar. When Letterboxd came along, obviously there was the 5-star scale, but you can do half a star, so that translates easily for your rating when you're used to it.
Yeah, it's a 10 out of 10 scale.
Yeah, definitely. But the 10 out of 10 scale, like Sol said, it's something that I grew up with on IMDb, so that's just stuck with me, and that's how it will be forever, I imagine, for me.
I use the 10 out of 10 scale on IMDb, but I would rather there was an option for 0.5. So I guess I would rather it was out of 20 because when I look back at like a 7 out of 10, I'd rather be able to put 7.5, 6.5, that kind of thing. I also don't like the star system. I don't know how people can rate out of 4 or 5. I think it's limiting, very limiting in what you can do. I think out of 100, I'd probably like as well, although I think eventually you get to a point where like, how can you rate something like 62 out of 100? It gets a bit too specific.
No, it gets too specific, but I think you're completely right, Adam. I would absolutely prefer a 20-point scale as well, because to me, like that's the difference between an 8 and an 8.5 and a 9 is really big, to me at least. Just the quantifying greatness is probably the thing I've struggled with the most, which is why I also used to go all the way to 200 scale back in the day, just because quantifying greatness, it's a really hard thing to do, and it just feels like there's so many levels of love.
Yeah, I think 20 would be my favorite scale if it was possible.
Maybe it's just me. I don't feel the need to quantify greatness. I mean, if it's something which I liked a lot or loved or whatever, I don't think I need to quantify whether I loved it, or whether I just liked it a lot. So that's why I just like that four value system. You know, the 4 stars, anything 8 out of 10 or above. It means it was amazing to me. It doesn't matter if it's 8 or 9 or 10 or 8.5, 9.5. I don't think for anybody reading my reviews or whatever, it's going to make that much more difference to them.
the thing is, you're approaching it from the point of view of other people reading your reviews, but my ratings are for me. So in like 10 years' time, maybe I'm looking at a list of Japanese films and the plots are very similar. And if I know I gave it as one film a 7.5, one film an 8, you know, it helps me to remember which one I preferred. And so I'm very much looking at it for my own point of view of ranking my films.
Well, actually, exactly the same for me. Like when I did out of 200, that was only for me and only so I could get a better idea of where I was ranking things. And this might just go back to list making and loving to make lists, etc. But one of the main reasons why I would break it down so much was because I would use this to create lists for anything. Like, so I could immediately know, okay, this is my yearly ratings. Now I'm going to make a top list of Spanish films or French films. I rated this one 8.7, I rated this one 8.6. This goes above the other one. So it was just like a really quick memory thing like that I could still use after 10 plus years. So I think when you break it down in that much details, it's mainly for yourself, not for an actual reader.
That's an interesting take. I mean, I get that. I guess I just feel for myself that if I couldn't remember enough about my position on a film, I don't know how comfortable I'll be feeling about including in a list in the first place, whether it was an 8.6 or an 8.3 or an 8.45 reoccurring or whatever. I don't know, maybe it's just me, but I found with a lot of lists that I've done for the forum lists, a lot of them are ones where I've deliberately left off films that I haven't seen in that many years, in which I don't really actually have a strict opinion on. I don't think I'd like to just go on the decimal point next to the 8 and next to the 7, how much I really liked it when ranking it.
Yeah, I can see that, Sol. I think I might be moving in that direction a little bit too. I think it was much more important like the first 10 plus years when I was watching films, because I would forget a lot of it, but I would have impressions, I would have memories of them. But now when I've been watching films for quite a long time, it changes a bit. You know, your taste has changed so much. You might not like some of these films you give an 8 anymore even. So it's stranger and stranger the longer you've been watching films, the more your taste has changed.
I get frustrated with ratings because kind of what Chris was just saying, maybe I watched a film 10 years ago and gave it a 9 out of 10. And then 10 years later, my rating scale might be quite different. So I find it really hard to make ranked lists. I find it kind of overwhelming because I'm like, oh, I've seen all these films. A 9 right now isn't the same as a 9 a few years ago. And I get too caught up in it all. And I end up just sort of giving up when I'm doing this half the time.
So I do think that we've been talking about how this distinguishing things gets more and more helpful for yourself the broader it gets. But I do think that when you strip away too many distinguishing marks, it starts to become pointless. So I really like the Sol's 4-point scale, where essentially anything that's mediocre or less, so anything that's typically rated 5 and down, just gets 0 because it's not interesting. I think that's a pretty good scale, though I would personally have liked that, you know, extra low rating where you just show, okay, this is just horrifyingly bad, and just warn people against it. But I think that's a really good and solid scale. However, I think one system I really, really dislike is the Siskel and Ebert at the movies rating system with thumbs up, thumbs down, which essentially is the Rotten Tomato system as well, with rotten or fresh tomatoes. And what I really hate about this system is that you just have two options. It's good or it's bad. It doesn't make any sense to me because like Saul pointed out earlier when he did this 4-point scale, like a 7, which is usually to most people a very good film, and a 6, which is usually to most people a good film, would get, you know, a 2 and a 1. But in the Rotten Tomato scale, like everything that's 6 plus would get a fresh tomato. So it's just meaningless to me. It can be the greatest film of all time, get 10 out of 10. And that's identical to someone that's thinking, this is a pretty okay film. That scale just is meaningless to me. What do you guys think about Rotten Tomatoes and the at the movies ratings?
I've never been a fan of the Rotten Tomatoes rating scale, and that's probably because I became obsessed with IMDb, and it's a lot clearer how a film is rated on there. I don't agree with the thumbs up, thumbs down scale, because as you say, it doesn't communicate enough about the quality of the film. It's just a coin flip. Is it good? Is it bad? Whereas the IMDb rating can paint a more clear picture of the quality of the film that you're going to see.
Yeah.
Rotten Tomatoes is very interesting, and the whole way that it's structured so that it tries to look at number of negative versus positive reviews. It does lead to a lot of things getting 99 or 100%, where a lot of the reviews are just 7 out of 10 rather than 9 or 10 out of 10 reviews. I don't take Rotten Tomatoes too seriously. It is one of the official lists on iCheckMovies, so I do have some interest in it, but not really a lot of interest. It's nothing that's really appealed to me that much.
Yeah, first of all, I'm a bit surprised that the Europeans are calling it Rotten Tomatoes, considering we normally pronounce it Rotten Tomatoes, especially Tom. I don't know what's going on there.
I would usually say tomatoes. I think it's just because I heard Chris say.
Tom, you've broken my heart here, so I don't even want an explanation.
But it's an American website, isn't it? He's being culturally sensitive.
Yeah, I think Chris started it, and Tom was trying to be polite by continuing instead. It's okay, I forgive you, Tom. I think that Rotten Tomatoes, they go for thumbs up and thumbs down for a reason, because people are on that site. They just want to get a quick, is this film good or bad? So I personally don't like the system. There's no way I would use it. But I don't think it's a rating system in the same way as we rate films. I think it's a very quick kind of good or bad. And that's what that website goes for. You want to go onto Rotten Tomatoes, you want to see if it's good or bad, basically.
Is good or bad even meaningful when it's like that boiled down? Like, if anything, I would have preferred great or not. If it's 8+, it gets fresh. If it's 7 down, it would get rotten. Like that would be preferable to me almost.
Every film would be rotten, almost every film.
Yeah, exactly. But it's just the entire spectrum of, pretty good to the greatest film of all time. It just becomes completely meaningless to me. Like, I would never personally want to seek out films that were just good, unless there was something really important about them.
I've also seen ones where they've given it a kind of a fresh rating, for example, or a rotten rating, and you read the review and you're like, I've read reviews and I thought, hey, this one's been given like a rotten rating, but actually it's fresh, or vice versa. I don't think it's a very good system, but I think they're going for the most simplest possible, which is not something I'm a fan of, but I understand why you might do that as a review website, because without doing that, the work that you'd need to put into a review website would become a lot more. So I think they want a straightforward system.
Well, yeah.
And I think things have moved. In general, in the world, things have moved to a much more kind of thumbs up, thumbs down system.
But if anyone ever watched at the movies, like even they moderated their system eventually. I remember the first episode when Roger Ebert pioneered this sideways thumb, which was mediocre. Like that would have been, or like okay, that would have been pretty good moderation too, where you could just have a gray tomato, like this middle point, because that middle point that's really frustrating. And like you said, Adam, like you can read a review and it's so negative and it still gets fresh. And that's because quite often a 6 out of 10 to people, which is, good enough usually, can come for films that are really disappointing, just very well made, for instance. I think I said more or less enough about it. I'm not even sure if this is a conspiracy theory, but I'll just throw in why I think it's the case. And that's because I think Rotten Tomatoes want to be on DVD covers and be listed various places. Or for just advertising purposes, where essentially any film can get a fresh score and it looks good and it can be used. That's my analysis or interpretation of why they would go with this system.
That's interesting, Chris, and I think you might be onto something there. It also baffles me as to how Rotten Tomatoes is made up of reviews from critics. That is used for the basis of the score, but it doesn't go into as much detail as IMDb, when IMDb is rated by just the public. You'd expect something where the score is based on critics' reviews to perhaps be more in detail and more in depth. So that has always surprised me.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
And it is strange to think that as huge film fans, we prefer the TV rating to Rotten Tomatoes rating. So we're basically siding with the general public on that.
So that's the Rotten Tomatoes system, and we all talked so much about IMDb and how that actually is quite okay. And we talked a little bit about Letterboxd. So which of these rating systems, though they're practically the same, do you prefer? Do you prefer the ratings on Letterboxd or IMDb?
They are basically the same. And what's even interesting is that I'd say very close to 100% of the time, the Letterboxd rating, if you double it, is 0.1 or 0.2 spots away from the IMDb rating. There's a few niche films where there is a bit of a difference in there, but for the vast majority of films, if it's a high score on one website, it'll be a high score on the other website. So for me, they're pretty much one and the same. They're the same sort of system. People are treating them and rating them the same way. They just are doubling or halving.
Well, that's incredible insight, Son. It's quite understandable too. But do you use IMDb ratings or Letterboxd ratings to inform what you view in any way?
Yeah, look, usually not. I mean, if it's something I've never heard of, I might look at the rating to see whether it's interesting. But, if it's something in the horror genre, as long as it's above 4.0 on IMDb, it's probably worthwhile because horror films are very harshly rated. If it's anything below 4 on IMDb or below 2 on Letterboxd, I probably would give it a skip unless it's really appealing. And, but I don't really use them that much. Sometimes look up a new film and I'm surprised about how high it's rated, and that does get me interested. But generally, I just go off direct as I go off word of mouth and what I've heard about the film on the I Check Movies forum. I don't usually pay that much attention to ratings unless it's something which is one of those big Oscar buzz films and it comes out with like a 5-point-something rating, something like The Midnight Sky from George Clooney, which I still ended up putting myself through, and it was not really worth it. But generally I don't pay that much attention to ratings.
Wow. I do actually use ratings quite a bit. It's those smaller signifiers. It won't necessarily make me watch a film if it's highly rated or discourage me if it has a very low rating. But usually, for instance, if I try to explore a new director for the first time, I'll either check which films are the highest rated, have the most votes, or for instance, are on the most top lists on I Check Movies, just to see like which are the most important films. Or perhaps if I get several of this person's film or several films from any kind of genre or category, etc., I will usually look at films with a 7+ ratings and be a little more suspicious of films with low ratings. Am I the only one doing that?
No, I do the same there, Chris. I always refer to IMDb or I Check Movies to see what lists a film is on. I will rarely watch a film if it's got a rating of a 6 or less on IMDb. I may be considered somewhat of a film snob in that regard, but I don't want to waste my time on watching rubbish films when there's so many great films out there. There are exceptions to that. If there's a film by a certain director or a film that covers a certain topic that really appeals to me, then I don't mind stepping below the 6 rating on IMDb, but that's a rule that I kind of adhere to in order to try and make sure that I'm only going to have a good experience when picking a film.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I also, if I'm going to the cinema, for example, or going to watch a new film, I instantly check IMDb ratings. I check the percentage on Rotten Tomatoes. If a film has a low rating, then I might just avoid it. And also, slightly off topic, but for me, 3 stars out of 5 sounds a lot better than 6 out of 10. Maybe that's just my personal, the way I use my ratings. So if I was to use a star system, as stupid as it might sound, it wouldn't translate directly to out of 10 for me, because 6 out of 10 for me isn't that great a film, whereas 3 stars sounds much better, but that's just my personal opinion. But yeah, I use ratings. I always look straight at a rating on IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes before I watch anything. And also, like Chris said, if I'm going to start watching a director or a certain set of films, maybe when I first started watching Japanese films, for example, went on IMDb and I checked the average rating. And I also think the average rating on IMDb, the older the film, the more accurate it's likely to be, I think, whereas some of the newer films come straight out with 8.5.
That's true. It usually takes about 6 months for the IMDb ratings to catch up and get less inflated. I don't know if that's because it's studios inflating them or whether it's just the people who want to see it first, and the people who are less interested see it later and it drops down. But yeah, for newer films, I pretty much know that the IMDb rating will go down by half a star or whatever by the time, 6 or 8 months have passed. It is interesting for me to also hear from you guys that so many of you actually look at Rotten Tomatoes, IMDb and everything before watching a film. I do always look at I Check Movies because if it's on an official list, it is more interesting. And I Check Movies has some data that goes along with it. So if it's got a high favourite to dislike ratio, then I can sort of go then on Letterboxd and sort of see what the reviews are like and sort of see what the star rating is. If I'm curious, I can go to IMDb, but I wouldn't really do much more than that. I'd usually just check what it's like on iCheckMovies and take it from there.
And one more thing on this, actually. I usually make my watch lists on IMDb as well. So I don't really use the main watch list function, but I make watch lists for each and every single year. And obviously you see that rating right below the title every single time. So it's just impossible for that not to have some kind of an impact, I think.
I think, just responding to Saul, I think that works better for older films, because if I use it, for example, if I'm going to the cinema and there's a whole bunch of new films that have come out, I can get a quick overview from IMDb and Rotten Tomatoes, even if it's not quite accurate. Whereas if I look at official lists for films from this year, it's not going to help me at all in terms of watching something.
I know that in terms of official lists, I know it's not going to make a difference, but I usually check the iCheckMovies page anyway, just out of force of habit. And sometimes when I go there, you can see from the number of favourites, the favourites to dislike ratio, or from the comments that people have written there. It usually gives me some indication of how the film's being perceived. It's not perfect. It's probably more just force of habit over the last few years since I've got interested in iCheckMovies. I just go there instantly. It's my number one place to go. It's probably not perfect, but I don't know. It's just what works for me.
I actually check the comments as well. I think in the past, I probably would have checked the little forum on IMDb, the specific film page forum. So I think I probably use iCheckMovies comments as like a kind of small substitute to that.
I think the iCheckMovies favourite ratio is pretty accurate and a good indication of whether I'm going to enjoy a film or not. I remember when I first joined iCheckMovies, the most favourite list was the one I became passionate about working on, and I discovered so many brilliant films through that. So I think the relatively smaller user base of iCheckMovies in comparison to something like IMDb or Letterboxd can work in its favour, because the people are all hardcore cinema fans whose tastes are going to be far similar to mine than the general public, so it is a good indicator.
That's another thing about iCheckMovies, is that the ratings aren't going to be inflated on there. Like on IMDb, everybody talks about ratings being inflated and sock puppets accounts created so students can push up their film. And the same would happen on Letterboxd because it's quite a well-known website, whereas iCheckMovies, it's less well-known. So I think there's more genuine users, if I can call them that. I think there's more genuine users on iCheckMovies, even though you do still get those occasional accounts which kind of like advertise different things.
Yeah, that's probably really true as well. It's not like I dismiss films that have, say, under 7 or under 6 out of 10. In fact, I noticed, I went to my list of my favorite films of the last decade, and 5 of the top 15 are actually rated under a 6 out of 10 of the IMDb users. So I think it can't be trusted completely depending on what your taste is. I'm quite interested in more art house films, for instance, and many of those are really divisive. And some of them get really big launches as well. Like, for instance, Only God Forgives. Obviously not for most people, got a really big launch with Ryan Gosling in the lead role, and that's just bound to get a low rating. I tend to also look at who the director is, what kind of style it's in, and before I make up my opinion of what the rating means. Usually, at least, audiences are somewhat predictable, so I can kind of see, okay, this is like a really popular film. This means that 8, for instance, means a little bit less in this area for me personally than for another type of film. So I can kind of quantify the style of the film, how it was released, and then try to guess what I will think about it.
I totally get that, Chris, and that just brings into mind how important it is to use a multitude of websites like we do to gather the information when making our decisions. Obviously, IMDb is my first touch point, but by using the other sites as well to gather the information, it helps to give a good indicator of whether I'm going to enjoy a film or not. And Only God Forgives is a great example because that's one that I loved, and the IMDb rating just doesn't do it justice from my perspective.
And this is also one of the reasons why it's so good to follow critic lists, especially critics that you think you have a great deal of things in common with. Follow the overall list from Sight and Sound, Clear the Cinema, etc., because there are films in those lists that do have shockingly low ratings, and you can maybe find some films that you might not have found otherwise. So I would never want to trust only average ratings. Some films are really divisive, and you might be in the group that loves them, and some films just have a low rating because everyone finds them mediocre or bad. So I always have a bit of distrust for average ratings. But I think Adam did bring up something really important earlier, which was that when he changes from a 1 to 10 scale to a star scale, which is 0.5 to 5, exactly the same scale, he actually would change the value of the rating because just the stars mean something else to him. And this made me think of a system which I thought was really widespread, but no one else had heard of because it apparently only exists in my native Norway as well as Sweden, which is the die system, which is where a film gets a rating from 1 to 6, 6 being the better, and is displayed on a die. And I think everyone were absolutely shocked when I told them that, because to them die is just something completely and utterly random.
Yeah, I had never heard of that rating system and was quite confused by it. It makes sense now, but it's just strange to think that something that's so commonplace to you can be completely alien to someone in another country.
Yeah, exactly. And I think this is also one of those systems where I adjust my 1 to 10 scale quite a bit, because the way it usually works is that 6 is a masterpiece, 5 is a great film, 4 is a good film, 3 is an okay film, and then 2 and 1 are variations of bad, essentially. And just like Saul, I would then change my system quite a bit. Like several 9s will become 6s, several 9s will merge in with 8s as 5s, and then my 7s will be 4s, and my 6s will be 3s, for instance. So I think when you just tweak the system slightly, just everything can really quickly go topsy-turvy. But yeah, we don't have to dwell on die writing. I really thought it was more common than it was. Like, that's actually the way I started rating films. Like, this is the way everyone rates films. This is the way we graded in Norway as well, by the way. We don't call it the die system, but we have like a 1 out of 6. So the 1 to 6 system is just so prevalent in Norwegian culture. Like, it's the die that decorate all of the movie posters at the cinema and the DVDs. The die are absolutely everywhere. It's used for book reviews, theater reviews, like anything you can imagine. It even used for health notices about how healthy products are. So the die is everywhere. It is not random, and it's been around since the 70s.
I don't think there's anything wrong with using a 1 to 6 scale, because why is it 1 to 5 or 1 to 10? But what confused me is the idea that if you roll dice, it's a random number that comes up. And I find it strange that you're rating on the basis of dice. That's the only thing that sounds weird to me. But I don't think 1 to 6 makes any less sense than 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 10. Ultimately, it's just whatever you're used to. But yeah, it's obviously a Norwegian thing.
Yeah, and I think that's even how we speak about. We always talk about let's roll the die when watching something. So it's it's just so seeped into the culture. But to get to the last rating scale that's quite prevalent, or the last two, the 1 to 100 and the percentage scale, which are essentially the same, except the percentages are 0 to 100 and the 1 to 100 scale is 1 to 100. So do you think these scales are too extreme? I obviously said I used to use these a little bit, but what's your general opinion about these, really large, really long and detailed rating scales?
Yeah, I think they're too extreme. I don't use them myself. I don't really see the need for it. I guess one of the big things about with my ratings is that my opinion about a film will wax and wane over the days and sometimes weeks since I've seen it. If I've got a collection of films that I've rated 7 out of 10, then in a couple of months' time, I can roughly order them. I sort of know what a 7 out of 10, is worth to me. And I feel that I can rearrange. That gives me more flexibility rather than cementing in and saying, well, this is a 64, this is a 62, this is a 65, this is a 61. That gives me no flexibility later on if I want to shuffle things around based on how my opinion of a film has evolved in the time since I've digested it. But I know that some people are very pedantic who like using it, but I think it's a bit too inflexible, a bit too rigid, because I don't think the film viewing experience is just one of like, oh, I've seen a film, I've rated it, that's it, I've digested it, the end. I think a film stays with you, and I think that's what you should really be rating, but maybe that's just me.
I agree with what Sol's saying there. I think it's too extreme. 1 to 10 is enough for me to rate a film. I don't want to go into 1 to 100 because it just opens up a whole kind of worms. I don't know how I'd be able to differentiate between a film that's, say, a 62 or a 63. So similar in quality, and that might change on any given day, as Sol has said, because a lot of your appreciation of a film is due to the emotional reaction that you have with the film at the time, and that can change as your experiences change over time, and your memories of the film ebb and flow as well, depending on your moods and where you're at in your life right now. So I think 1 to 10 gives enough flexibility to give a clear indicator of how you felt about a film without getting too lost in a larger scale of numbers.
I get what Tom and Sol are saying, although I think their arguments are more against rating films in general. I don't know, I feel like Sol, for example, finds reviews and written kind of things about a film much more important than numbers. For me, like I said earlier, I think out of 20 would be my ideal system, because I can say something's a good 6, a good 7, a bad 6, bad 7. I think if it was out of 100, it just gets way too difficult to differentiate between a 61 and a 62, a 63. But I understand why people do it. I don't think it's always because they're obsessed with numbers or obsessed with exact ratings. I just think sometimes if you're doing it just out of 10, it's quite hard, because I could give like 10 films a 7 and my opinion of them could still be very different. So I can understand why people might like a more specific system. And for me, out of 20 would be the best.
Yeah, I can see that, Adam, and I agree. Though I do think we're doing what we said we wouldn't do here. We've been talking so much about various rating scales and which ones are better, that we almost missed out on the value of communication, which is really what this is all about, at least if you rate publicly. So do you think that, for instance, if you rate a film 7 out of 10 or 8 out of 10, do you think someone can just look at that and get some kind of clear information from it? Or do you think it's just worthless?
I think that it's quite useful. I will often check and see when people have either favorited a film, and I check movies, or rated a film of 8 or above on Letterboxd. If that happens, then I will investigate the film more and think someone's obviously loved this film. It could be worth checking out, and potentially add it to my watch list then. So I do find the ratings useful, just so that you can understand what other people thought of the film at a quick glance.
I think the ratings for me are useful, but only if you know the person behind it. So, for instance, I know that if Tom rates something as 3 stars or above on Letterboxd, it means he liked it, even though 3 stars to me is above average. I know for him it's a good rating. Conversely, we've got people like Kong's Speech, who's one of our forum users, who has a lot of films 4.5 and 5 stars. So I know that a 4.5 or 5 is not quite as meaningful as if I saw Tom gave something a 5, would be like, whoa, must be absolutely amazing. And then conversely, you've got people who are more conservative with their ratings. So another shout out to Onderhon, who's one of our Belgian users, and he's very conservative with his ratings for older films. So it's a film from before 1990 and he's given it 2.5 stars or more. I know that he actually really, really liked it.
Not sure about that, but go ahead.
Oh, not that he really, really liked it, but he actually found quite a bit of interest in it. So a lot of the films, like when I talked to him and discussed them on the forum, on the weekly thread, I can see there was actually a lot of positive things that he liked about Videodrome, even though he gave it 2.5 stars. And I go, oh, actually, for an older film, that's really high rating for you. So I'm just saying a lot of it just depends on the users themselves. But if you know people themselves, are conservative or how generous they tend to be, then the ratings can be meaningful. In general, I'd say for most people, 3.5 stars or 7 out of 10 or more would mean that they liked it. But what's confusing is probably the 4, the 5, the 6 out of 10, those middle ratings. For different people, they vary between whether it's above average, average, or below average. So if somebody gives it a 3 stars or 2.5 or a 2, and I don't know who they are, I actually don't know that well whether they liked it or not. Likewise, if they gave it 1.5 stars or below, I'm pretty sure they didn't like it. But those middle ratings, unless you know the person, the 2.5, 3 stars, I think is very unclear.
I was going to say something similar to Saul, that without knowing how a person rates films, I think the numbers are kind of meaningless. I mean, for me personally, if I give something a 6 out of 10, it means I don't really like it very much. Whereas that doesn't make much sense to a lot of people, where 6 out of 10 might be a good film. I think that alongside the number, you need some kind of opinion from the person for it to mean anything. And that's why, like, when I rate films, the rating is kind of just for me. And if I was supposed to put a film on the forum, I think the words I'd say about it would be more important, because the number is just my own personal rating for me. I just think me saying to someone, oh yeah, this is 7 out of 10, it's worthless by itself.
Well, I think I'm in the Tom category there, or Saul category as well. That, if you know the person, you have a general idea of their rating scale and what they think. A rating can actually mean quite a lot. Like if someone I know that rarely gives out 10 out of 10 and they give a 10 out of 10 or even a 9 out of 10, this is something that's deeply loved by them. This is something that might be in their top 100 even, or top 250. So this is something that should definitely be investigated. And if I know that I have a lot of favorites in common with this person, I might get really excited. This might be because I've been on forums for so long and been rating things for so long. We don't do it on ICM forum. Maybe we should, but on Film General on IMDb, before forums were closed, we would frequently rate films per year, and then the highest average rating would win. And there, of course, it became quite important to kind of try to normalize and standardize the rating scale, because if you got these people which always rated films very low, like these really harsh raters, like they could completely crush any film they had seen, even if they liked it. So I think I became quite focused on trying to normalize my rating scales. And I think most people more or less have exactly the same 10 out of 10 scale. Like the little tweaks are different, but like 10 out of 10, fantastic or masterpiece, etc. Like one of the greatest films of all time. 9 out of 10 would be, a wonderful, great, again, fantastic film, but not as great as 10. And then 8 would be generally great, 7 very good, 6 good. Some people it's just okay, but it's in that ballpark. 5 would be for some people okay, for some people mediocre, but again, more or less the same. 4, poor, weak film. 3 and down, usually variations of bad. So say bad, terrible, god awful or disgustingly awful, etc. I think almost everyone has more or less managed to fit in the ratings on that scale. But there are some exceptions, of course, and that's when things can get a little bit confusing.
I think it's interesting, Chris, how you mentioned that the opinions of others could skew a film's rating somewhat. And it's just reminded me that when I first started watching films in the IMDb Top 250 and was obsessed with the ratings, I had some friends who would purposefully go on IMDb and give films extreme ratings just to wind me up, just to show me that they've done it. I doubt that their ratings would have skewed the vote that much.
There has been larger efforts of this kind. I didn't even want to mention it, but I mean, the whole reason why The Godfather is not the number one film on IMDb, and this is well known, was a spam campaign from 2009 or 2008 to maintain The Dark Knight Rises as number one. So essentially, we're just rating Godfather. Everybody was just rating The Godfather 1 out of 10 because they loved the Dark Knight. Like that's the whole reason. And obviously, The Dark Knight fell further down, and now Shawshank is number one. Not the intended result for these people, but because hundreds or thousands, maybe even, don't know how many people did it, but because so many people downrated The Godfather, they had such a massive impact on the top 3 positions.
It's crazy, isn't it, that people go to those kind of extremes, because they enjoy certain films so much that they will sabotage other films just for a rating to go up a few places.
Yeah, exactly. such a big mobilization effort to destroy one film in favor of it. It's really interesting. And obviously it does even have a little bit of a social impact, because IMDb Top 50 is still one of the most respected or viewed lists for a lot of people. And the number one there still has a lot of focus. I think I've actually seen ads, etc., listing Shawshank Redemption as the best film according to IMDb Top 250. And again, that's simply because people wanted The Dark Knight to win. And of course, we've also seen some other really fun times when people from specific countries have upvoted films. And I know Adam, especially, and a lot of people are really frustrated with, the extreme amount of love a lot of Turkish voters showed their favorite films. It could be their personal opinion as well, but just the onslaught of really high ratings for certain films, to the point that IMDb actually stepped in and removed some films. I remember How About Zanifi got its rating removed simply because so many people from Turkey loved it, and that it was, in their opinion, seemingly messing up the top 250. But this is not a Turkish phenomenon. Like, Norway did exactly the same thing with Max Manus. We're just a smaller country, but when Max Manus came out, again, that's over 10 years ago, I know there was a massive Norwegian campaign to get that and keep that in the top 250 at all costs. It managed to stay there a little bit. So this is just one of those really interesting things where people really care about ratings and IMDb.
It works though, Chris, because it makes you want to see a film if it's in the top 250. Well, it did it at one time, so you can see why people get behind these marketing campaigns. I've never actually watched Max Manus, but it was on my radar exactly because of that popularity campaign that you mentioned. So these things do have an impact. As ridiculous as they sound, it is a way to influence people to get to watch a film they may not otherwise watch.
Well, what you guys are saying is one of the reasons I stopped working on the top 250, and I don't think I would ever work on it again. I think I started probably about 12 years ago. I was doing the top 250, and if you look at it now, I feel like there's been a movement towards more recent films, but I can't actually quantify that.
It has.
And also, from a couple of countries, there's certain films in the list where those countries have some excellent films, but the types of the excellent films they have they don't make it in the top 250. The ones that make it in the top 250 from those countries tend to be ones that I wouldn't like. So I stopped completely working on it because of that. There was a point in my life years ago when I would sit for a film for a couple of hours, even though I didn't like it. And now it's like, I can't really be bothered, and I know I'm not going to like it, so what's the point?
No, it's exactly the same. Yeah. And this even fits in with the curve, because the fact that Adam and I and a few other people, Lauren included, would watch a lot of bad films. It started off with some of these really big, high-rated films, or films were on lots of lists that we knew would be bad for whatever reason. And then we went on to, the worst list of all time, like IMDb Bottom 100, for instance. And it was a bit of fun, but it did help me get more of a bell curve to my ratings, because before that, I was hardly watching anything bad.
We basically watched maybe like 20, 30 films, either ones with ridiculously high ratings from certain countries or bottom 100 films. It was like, it didn't last that long because it kind of became so painful. It was also when we were watching the top 50s from IMDb, there would always be a few films that would like sneak in that were really painful to watch. That's kind of what started it.
Do any of you disagree with the general 1 to 10 rating scale I put out earlier? I guess Tom might, but anybody else disagree with this idea where, 10 is a masterpiece, 9 is fantastic, 8 is great, 7 is very good, 6 is good, 5 mediocre, okay, 4 poor, 3 bad, 2 terrible, and 1 god-awful. Does anyone have a big disagreement with that scale?
Not a big disagreement, but I guess I use it slightly differently. The only ratings that I really give out are 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8 out of 10. I don't really give out any other ratings, or not very often. I went back and looked at my Letterboxd statistics of the last 1,260 films that I've logged. I've given none of them half a star. I've given 2 of them 1.
Can I just ask, 1,260 films, that's a very specific number. I'm just curious as to why.
Well, that's when I joined Letterboxd. I only joined it in December of 2019. I would have liked to have squeezed more films in, but I haven't. And importing my ratings is too hard because only can put 800 at a time, so I've never done that. Just of what I've got in Letterboxd. Sorry, I guess the way I said it did sound a bit random. But of what I've logged since December 30, 2019, I've got 0 halves, I've got 2 1-stars, I've got 3 1.5 stars, and I've got 58 2-star films. It's only really from 2 stars and above that I really start giving those sort of ratings out. And yeah, basically when it gets to 2 stars or 4 out of 10 for me, that means that I didn't like the film. I mean, I've used the 1, 2, and 3 out of 10 for like some extreme cases where I really didn't like it, but it's really meaningless to me. If I didn't like it a lot, it's a 4 out of 10. I don't really need to go any further. But yeah, 5 is mediocre or average for me. 6 is above average. 7 is really good. But then again, at the top of the scale, 8, 9, 10, they mean the same to me, really. Whether I give it an 8 or 9 or a 10, I mean, if I rewatch it, I might fiddle with that just from my own personal perspective, and I might fiddle with what I rate it on the Letterboxd, but 8, 9, or 10 for me is pretty much all the same. Just like 1, 2, and 3 for me is pretty much all the same.
For me, they're pretty different, especially 8, 9, 10. I mean, anything from 3 and down, I do hate, but it is quantifying variations of hate. But no, I almost never see 1, 2, or 3 either. It was only back when I was watching a lot of these bottom 100 and a few other films with Lauren, Adam, and a few other people that I was actually seeing a decent few of these terrible films. Like in general, you never, ever see films this bad.
I try and avoid films that are rated 1 to 3, and I can't remember the last one I've seen that I've given out that rating. As Sol said, 4 and below is pretty much a dislike. But I also think about as well as my enjoyment of the film, think about the craft and the work that has gone into the film. These films, although they might not have resonated with me, there's someone's labour of love, and you've got to appreciate the craft and the effort and ambition, even if it might not have resulted in a great film to watch. So I kind of look out for that and try and appreciate the positive aspects of a film, even if it is a largely negative experience. Having said that, I also rarely rate films 9 or a 10 on the other extreme of the scale. But when I do, it's going to be a film that I absolutely loved and connected with me in a way that most films don't.
Yeah, I feel the same way.
Okay, first of all, I really love Tom's kind of passion about film to the point that he looks to try and appreciate every film, respects that people have made a film. I think that's what drives his film purism as well. But I've seen so many like terrible films that when I'm watching them, I really don't care about the fact that people have made it, because I think sometimes films are made and it's not for good reasons. I think sometimes there's bad filmmakers, just that there's bad people who are bad at every job.
I love the fact that it's bad people, like they're morally bad, they're just sneaking out there with these mustaches, just like...
Well, if you sit through some of the worst films, I'm not convinced they're not bad people who made them and made me suffer. But in terms of the 1 to 10 thing, I have a pretty weird kind of system where a 6 out of 10 basically for me means I didn't really like the film. For me, 8 plus means I really like the film. 7 is kind of okay. 7 and 6 are kind of okay, but
yeah, pretty much the same.
Yeah, 5 below is basically a dislike. So it causes a lot of confusion. Like when I talk to Lauren, if I give something a 6, my 6 is so different from hers that that's part of the reason I think numbers and ratings are quite hard to talk about, because it means something very different to different people. But yeah, 8 plus for me would be good.
I think you snuck into something else there too, though, because you talk about things like kinda like and like, etc. These words that people kinda modify to various ends too. Like for some people, when they say they really like a film, they mean it's a really great film or even a fantastic film. Like some people could even say, like casually, I really like this film, and it could be, the greatest film of all time to them. Like that's how they would use language. And I think it even varies a bit based on how language is used. I think, for instance, like feels stronger in Norwegian than in English, for instance. So it's a bit of an odd thing too.
I think another thing about ratings that I just remembered was I've seen people post online, maybe even on the forum, that they never give a film like below a 4, and I find that really bizarre, because that means you're rating a film out of 7, basically. So I know Tom and Sol said they hardly ever give films like 1, 2, or 3 because they don't watch terrible films. But the idea of specifically like not ever giving out a certain rating to me makes little sense. I've also seen like times when people will only give a 10 out of 10 to like 10 films. I kind of understand it, but yeah, it's interesting to see different systems.
It might be Tom.
It's not me. For the record, I've got about 30 10 out of 10s from about 5,000 films watched. But I don't keep a track of it. If I watch a film and it's a 10 out of 10, I won't have to rate another film down. It's just a 10 out of 10. That's how it is.
Ooh, moving away from what you said earlier too, with a specific top 500. To you, do your ratings have like a word equivalent, like an 8 is great or an 8 is fantastic, or is it just based on the amount of films in your top 500, or like this top echelon?
Yeah, the top echelon, it doesn't really come into it. I've got no problem with having more than 500 8 out of 10s or whatever. I suppose for me, 10 out of 10 is masterpiece, perfect film. Mm-hmm. 9 out of 10 I would consider near masterpiece. There's just something that didn't quite work for me there, mm-hmm. but I still absolutely loved it. And 8 is an excellent or great film, which, as I said earlier, was one that when I started rating films would be a film that I would see comfortably in my top 250. But then it also brought a later meaning to it where if a film's got an 8 or out of 10 or above, it was one that I would quite happily have in my DVD or Blu-ray collection. So I would want to own and have that. I've not kept on top of that, so there's a lot of films rated 8 or above that I haven't got. Some just aren't available, and it's tricky to keep on top of them. But that's the kind of what's in the back of my mind when I'm rating a film. Yeah,
I like how you kind of merge it with real things, like things you would actually purchase and put in your home as well. So that's I really like that. I don't think about it the same way, but I think in terms of the words we use and the feelings we have for the films, it more or less matches. Though I have noticed though that you push your 7s, I think, a lot stronger than I push my 7s. Which might mean that at least some of my 8s might be your 7s or vice versa. But that's, I guess, one of those common things when you kind of have these words that can be interpreted slightly different ways.
Definitely, and it's interesting to hear everyone's different perspectives and how they rate films, because we've all got a lot of similarities, but at the same time, just the difference between one number can mean a lot between different people, and it's fascinating to hear.
Yeah, exactly. I think here, though, we at least have more or less the same scales, just slight variations. And I guess you can almost do a bell curve of these variations where Adam and Lauren might be on slightly different sides of the bell curve, but that's about it, because Lauren obviously really likes her 6s. Like, I guess for Lauren, a 6 is a very strong 7, while for I can't really quantify it because words and ratings mean so many different things, but like at least it seems most people, like I said earlier, are in sync.
I'm just going to jump in just with the whole 7s and 8s discussion. I've got way too many 7s because I guess like Tom initially, the films I was giving 8 out of 10 to, this is back in 2001, 2002, going back about 15 or 20 years ago, the films I was giving 8 out of 10 to were the films I thought were good enough, my own top 250 or top 300 or whatever. I've created a bit of an artifice in there because suddenly I've got all these films that I've given 7 to, which I like a lot, but when I watched them back in 2006 or 2007, or at that point when I watched them, like, well, it's not good enough to be in my top 250, so I'm just going to give it a 7, even though I liked it a lot. A lot of my 7s should be closer to 8, and I've tried to fix it up in Letterboxd. So a lot of films that I've read, not a lot, but I'd say, I don't know, maybe about 20% of the films that I've given a 7 to an IMDb in the last year, I've actually done as a 4 stars on Letterboxd, just because I'm sort of trying to round up the 7.5 to an 8 that it should be. So it's a bit of a problem just going back to when I started rating films. Yeah, I guess 7 or 8, either way, it means that I like to film a lot.
Oh, I love this. This is so specifically endorsing the 20-point scale.
No, I do not want a 20-point scale. I really just want to get rid of all my ratings altogether. I know that I sort of need them to be able to communicate for people at a glance what I thought about a film. But yeah, the more I think about it, the more, I don't really want to rate films. I mean, films are, pieces of art, they're experiences. Is there really the need to qualify or quantify that experience? Can't we just describe and share the experience rather than having to actually put a numerical score on it? But I don't know, just me.
No, I think that's such a perfect way to sum up everything that ratings are too, though. Like really or extremely quick communication, because like you mentioned, we more or less have the same rating scales. Most people more or less know what an 8 out of 10 means or a 7 out of 10 means. So it's just here, information, and that's it. You can digest like thousands of these in a minute. You can just scroll through something and see thousands of these ratings and get them like this little bite size of information about what you thought of them from it. And that's really all that they are. And you can miss any kind of nuance, anything of interest, which is both good and bad. And I think I actually completely agree with what you said earlier, Saul, in terms of removing ratings from your reviews, because that's both good and bad. I think I've been toying with that idea as well, because if I add a rating, I can be pretty sure that most people will just see the rating and skim past my review and not think about it. If I don't include the rating, I think it's a much higher chance that some of them will actually read the review. But then again, I guess a large amount just won't even register anything I'm trying to tell them. So it is a bit of a give and take if I want to promote a film.
I think it's Sight and Sound magazine that do the same and don't provide a rating, just provide the review. And that's the angle that they're going for. So I can totally understand that.
Let me just check that really quickly. I have my Sight and Sound right here. So I'm just going to scroll up to the review section. And yes, you are completely right. There's not a single rating or indication of rating at all here. So yeah, you're completely right. And obviously I do read all of the reviews in it. I might skip some I don't want any spoilers of, because the one thing that's really annoying with Sight and Sound is that they sometimes just spoil things without warning. But there we go, Sight and Sound, no ratings. Soul is on the side of Sight and Sound. So I guess then to kind of just wrap all of this up, and I think we covered more or less everything. We end this on what we talked about earlier, communication. Do you think it's sad or not that good that people are perhaps more interested in a rating than reading what you think about the film, especially if you're writing reviews? Is that something that you find disappointing or troubling or tragic?
It's not something that's ever actually crossed my mind, but I suppose that when I think about it, the reason I rate and review films is generally to share and highlight the films that I think are deserving of more attention and that people should watch. So if someone sees that I've rated a film a 9 out of 10, whether or not they read my review, if that rating encourages them to check the film out, then I suppose that makes me happy. That's all that matters. If someone wants to read my review, great. But if they're checking out a film because of a rating that I've given it, then that's a good thing for me.
I don't know if I'd say that it's disappointing or sad necessarily. It would be nice, I guess, if there was more emphasis placed on opinions rather than just numerical values that are sometimes somewhat randomly assigned to films. But it's really part of the way that society is progressing. You just need to go into Letterboxd and look at some of the one-line reviews and some of the one-word things that people are writing, or the communication via emojis these days. Everybody's just wants something short, which is good, but it's against film discussion. And I guess I've sort of grown up on movie forums ever since I was a teenager. And I've sort of got really into that mindset of being able to dissect and discuss films in depth. And going by numerical ratings seems to go against that. But I think it's also a bit inevitable with the way that society is heading at the moment. So I guess it is a little bit sad, but it's something that I accept. And I guess probably the most disappointing thing to me is when people take my ratings. Like I told you, my friend who keeps refreshing my IMDb page, when people take my ratings so seriously. I guess that's what I find disappointing. People complain about me rating something too high or too low, because I'm like, well, don't concentrate on the rating. Actually look at what I've written about it. What have I said about it? Don't ask me why it's not 5 stars or why it's only 2 stars or whatever. Actually look at what I've written and discuss that with me, and don't fixate on the ratings. I guess that's disappointing when people fixate on the rating.
I totally get what Tom and Saul are saying, but I think if you write a proper review of the film, whether or not there's a 7 out of 10 at the start or at the end, if people are going to read your review, they're going to read it regardless. I do agree that there's been a kind of movement to people writing less and just using like thumbs up, thumbs down, that kind of thing. But I do think a rating can go alongside a detailed review and not detract from it.
I love reading through reviews after I watch a film just to gain other people's perspectives. And hopefully there's lots of other people out there with a similar viewpoint to mine who like finding out what other people made of certain films.
Yeah, I completely agree with that. I think that ratings are really useful. So I do like average ratings, even though I'm suspicious of them, especially, for instance, when we're on the forum and you see ratings from people, you can see ratings specifically from people you have an opinion closer to. You can see ratings specifically from critics you're closer to, and get a really quick and often quite accurate idea even. Obviously, you get more information when you read the reviews. I love reading good reviews. That's also why I love Sight and Sound, etc. And it's really nice to both before and after, though it can be a little bit dangerous before sometimes because some people sneak in spoilers. But it's so nice to get more understanding of why people like a film, to dive into the nuances and discuss them with them. I agree with Saul that it's disappointing that it might just be boiling down to only ratings. And I do hope that changes and that people get more and more interested in what other people actually got from the film and diving into that and discussing that and learning from that, seeing things different ways. But I do think ratings are really useful. And I think most rating systems, except, and I will say this strongly, except thumbs up, thumbs down, and Rotten Tomatoes, do provide some actual value. And I do hope this episode has provided some value as well, that we've been able to go through these rating systems and talk through them, discover what's good and bad about them, that we actually had a proper look at what we're communicating, how good that communication is. This is also left for you to decide, so feel free to come to icmforum.com, find our thread about this with the link to this episode, and tell us what you think. Are we completely off? Are ratings completely useless? Is Rotten Tomatoes actually the best system in the world? Join the discussion. Do let us know. And thank you so much for listening. Join us again soon. You have been listening to Talking Images, the official podcast of icmforum.com.